There comes a moment in inner development when love no longer arrives as a thunderbolt that overwhelms the psyche. What once felt like destiny begins to reveal itself as projection. In earlier stages of life, love often emerges from unconscious hunger, the desire to be completed, rescued, or mirrored by another. We fall in love not with the person as they are, but with the image they carry for us, an image shaped by unmet needs and unresolved inner fractures. As awareness deepens, this mechanism becomes visible. The awakened individual begins to recognize how attraction was once fueled by inner lack. Romance was charged with intensity because it promised wholeness, but awakening does not numb the heart, it clarifies it. When the inner divisions are faced and integrated, the compulsive pull toward another weakens. Love is no longer driven by urgency or fantasy. This shift can feel unsettling. The old intoxication disappears. Butterflies fade. The emotional highs and lows that once defined passion no longer dominate experience. What replaces them is a quieter presence, a grounded capacity to see another person clearly, without myth or illusion. The awakened no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. They also become aware that many relationships were contracts of unconscious exchange. I will be who you need if you save me from myself. Awakening dissolves these bargains. Without the need to be rescued or to rescue, attraction based on imbalance loses its grip. The drama that once masqueraded as love is recognized as repetition, not connection. This does not mean the awakened withdraw from love. Rather, love changes its form. It becomes less about falling and more about standing, less about possession and more about encounter. The awakened can love deeply, but they do not disappear into the other. They remain whole while relating, which feels unfamiliar in a world addicted to emotional fusion. To those still asleep to their inner world, this new way of loving can seem distant or cold. But it is not detachment, it is clarity. The awakened heart no longer seeks completion through another, it seeks resonance. And resonance does not erupt, it unfolds. In this state, love is no longer something that happens to you. It is something you bring, consciously, freely, without illusion, and that is why the awakened do not fall in love as they once did. They no longer fall at all. They meet. Early love often emerges not from clarity, but from a silent hunger within the psyche. Long before awareness develops, the inner world is shaped by unmet needs, unexpressed emotions, and fragmented aspects of the self-seeking recognition. When another person appears who seems to carry what is missing inside, attraction ignites with unusual force. This intensity feels like destiny, but it is frequently the psyche attempting to restore balance by reaching outward instead of inward. In this state, the beloved becomes a screen upon which unconscious material is projected. Qualities long disowned or undeveloped within oneself, strength, tenderness, confidence, creativity, safety, are perceived as belonging exclusively to the other. The person is not loved as they are, but as a symbol of inner completion. What feels like deep connection is often the recognition of one's own hidden potential reflected back through another human being. Because this process remains unconscious, it carries a sense of urgency. Early love feels overwhelming, consuming, and emotionally charged. The fear of loss is intense because losing the other feels like losing access to the missing parts of the self. Attachment forms quickly, not because true intimacy has developed, but because the psyche has tied its sense of wholeness to an external figure. The other becomes emotionally indispensable. This is why early love often carries contradiction. It feels expansive yet anxious, ecstatic yet fragile. Moments of closeness bring euphoria, while distance or conflict triggers deep insecurity. Tie. These emotional swings are not signs of depth but of dependency. The inner lack has not been addressed, so the relationship becomes responsible for stabilizing the inner world. Love turns into a psychological necessity rather than a free encounter. Unconscious projection also distorts perception. Flaws are minimized, warning signs ignored, and incompatibilities reframed as romantic tension. The psyche defends the illusion because it serves an internal need. To see the other clearly would threaten the fantasy of completion. When reality eventually intrudes, disappointment feels devastating, not only because the relationship falters, but because the inner emptiness resurfaces. Early love is therefore less about union with another and more about escape from oneself. The longing is not truly for the person, but for relief from inner fragmentation. Without awareness, this pattern repeats across relationships, with different faces carrying the same symbolic weight. Each new love promises fulfillment, yet none can sustain it, because the source of the longing remains untouched. This stage of love is not a failure or a mistake. It is a necessary expression of an undeveloped relationship with the self. Through these experiences, the psyche reveals where integration is needed. Only by recognizing projection and inner lack can love evolve from unconscious necessity into conscious choice. Awakening begins with a subtle shift in perception, a moment when attraction is no longer experienced only as emotion, but is observed as a psychological movement within. What once felt spontaneous and unquestionable starts to reveal a deeper structure. The intensity of desire, the pull towards certain types of people, and the repetition of similar relationship patterns begin to make sense when seen through awareness. Attraction is no longer interpreted as fate, but as information about the inner world. Before awakening, unmet psychological needs operate quietly in the background. The need for validation, safety, belonging, recognition, or emotional containment searches for fulfillment through another person. Attraction becomes the mechanism through which the psyche attempts to meet these needs externally. The person who seems to offer what is lacking feels magnetic, even irresistible. This pull is not random. It is shaped by early experiences, emotional wounds, and parts of the self that did not receive adequate expression or care. As awareness deepens, the individual begins to notice that attraction is strongest where there is inner absence. The longing for closeness often conceals a fear of abandonment. The desire for intensity hides a hunger for aliveness. The attraction to authority or strength may reveal an undeveloped inner stability. What once appeared as romantic chemistry is now recognized as compensation. The psyche was not choosing freely, it was compensating for imbalance. This realization can be disorienting. Awakening strips attraction of its innocence. The romantic narrative weakens, and the emotional charge softens. The individual may feel as though something essential has been lost, when in truth, something unconscious has been exposed. The disappearance of compulsive attraction is not emotional numbness, but the psyche no longer grasping for what it lacks. With this clarity comes responsibility. If attraction was fueled by unmet needs, then those needs must be addressed internally. Emotional regulation replaces dependency. Self-validation begins to replace the search for external affirmation. Inner stability reduces the urgency for attachment. The psyche gradually learns to provide what it once demanded from others. As this happens, attraction changes its quality. Rather than being driven by hunger, it becomes responsive. Instead of seeking completion, it seeks compatibility. The awakened individual is no longer pulled toward people who trigger wounds in familiar ways. The nervous system no longer confuses anxiety with XEI, torment or instability with passion. Attraction becomes quieter, slower, and less dramatic, which can feel unfamiliar to those accustomed to emotional intensity. Awakening does not eliminate desire, it refines it. The individual still feels drawn to others, but the draw no longer overrides discernment. There is space to observe, to choose, and to remain grounded. Attraction is no longer a command, but an invitation. What once compelled the psyche now informs it, revealing not what is missing, but what is aligned. In the unexamined stages of emotional life, intensity often masquerades as depth. Strong reactions, rapid attachment, and dramatic emotional swings are interpreted as signs of profound connection. The faster the bond forms and the more powerful the feelings, the more real the relationship is believed to be. Yet this confusion arises not from intimacy itself, but from the nervous system responding to familiarity, unpredictability, and unresolved inner patterns. Emotional drama thrives on instability, sudden closeness followed by distance, affection alternating with withdrawal, reassurance followed by doubt. These cycles generate heightened sensation. The psyche mistakes this stimulation for connection because it feels alive. The body releases adrenaline, attachment hormones surge, and attention becomes consumed by the other. What feels like passion is often the activation of old emotional conditioning rather than genuine relating. As awareness deepens, this pattern becomes visible. The individual begins to notice that relationships charged with drama rarely offer safety or understanding. The mind is preoccupied, the heart is unsettled, and the self is constantly adjusting to the emotional state of another. There is little room for presence. Intensity demands reaction, not reflection. It keeps the psyche engaged but not nourished. True intimacy, however, requires stability. It grows in spaces where the nervous system can relax, where expression is met with understanding rather than escalation. When awakening occurs, the individual becomes sensitive to the difference between emotional activation and emotional connection. What once felt exciting now feels draining. The appetite for chaos diminishes because its cost becomes clear. This shift can feel like loss. Without emotional drama, relationships may initially seem flat or uninspiring. The absence of highs and lows can be mistaken for lack of chemistry. Yet what is missing is not intimacy but dependency on stimulation. The awakened individual begins to recognize that constant emotional arousal was a substitute for depth, not its evidence. As inner regulation strengthens, attraction to instability fades. There is less tolerance for confusion, mixed signals, and emotional games. Not because the heart has closed, but because it has learned discernment. Intimacy is no longer measured by how intensely emotions are provoked, but by how safely truth can be expressed. In this state, connection unfolds slowly. Trust develops through consistency rather than crisis. Affection grows through shared presence, not emotional volatility. Silence becomes comfortable. Differences can exist without threatening the bond. This kind of intimacy may appear quiet from the outside, but it is rooted in mutual recognition rather than emotional entanglement. When intensity is no longer mistaken for intimacy, relationships stop being arenas for unresolved emotion and become spaces of genuine encounter. The awakened individual does not seek to be overwhelmed, they seek to be understood, and to understand in return. Many relationships are entered long before either person is consciously aware of why the bond feels necessary. Beneath affection, attraction, and shared experience, there often exists an unspoken agreement formed by unconscious needs. These silent contracts govern how love is exchanged, how conflict is tolerated, and how identity is shaped within the relationship. They are rarely articulated, yet they exert powerful influence over behavior and attachment. An unconscious relationship contract is not a deliberate bargain, but a psychological alignment. One person may offer emotional caretaking in exchange for feeling needed. Another may provide stability in return for protection from abandonment. These roles feel natural because they mirror early emotional patterns. The psyche seeks familiarity, even when familiarity includes imbalance. What binds the relationship is not mutual presence, but mutual compensation. As long as the self remains fragmented, these contracts feel necessary. Each person carries parts of themselves that remain undeveloped or disowned, and the relationship becomes the structure that holds those missing elements in place. The fear of losing the other is amplified because it threatens the fragile equilibrium that the contract maintains. Love becomes entangled with survival, obligation, and fear. Self-integration begins to dissolve this dynamic. As awareness grows, individuals start to reclaim the parts of themselves that were outsourced to the relationship. Emotional regulation, self-worth, inner authority, and self-expression gradually move inward. What was once provided by the other is now cultivated internally. This does not happen abruptly, but through repeated moments of recognition and responsibility. As integration deepens, the old contracts lose their function. The caretaker no longer needs to be needed, the dependent no longer needs rescuing, the compliant no longer needs approval to exist. The roles that once structured the relationship begin to feel restrictive. Patterns that were tolerated for the sake of emotional security now feel misaligned. This is often the point where tension arises, not because love has vanished, but because the unconscious agreement has expired. Some relationships cannot survive this shift. When a bond is built primarily on mutual lack, integration destabilizes it. The relationship may feel unfamiliar, distant, or strained as the old dynamics no longer operate. Attempts to restore the previous balance can feel forced or inauthentic. Separation in such cases is not a failure but a consequence of growth. Other relationships transform. When both individuals integrate their disowned parts, the bond can be renegotiated consciously. Love is no longer maintained through obligation or unconscious exchange, but through choice. The relationship becomes a meeting of two whole individuals rather than a system of mutual compensation. In this way, self-integration quietly dissolves unconscious contracts. What remains is either a relationship rooted in presence and freedom, or the clarity to release what was held together by unmet needs. In early experiences of love, the language itself reveals the psychology behind it. To fall in love implies a loss of balance, a surrender of inner ground. The self descends into the emotional field of another, often dissolving personal boundaries in the hope of union. This form of love feels powerful because it temporarily relieves the burden of individuality. The weight of selfhood is shared, identity blurs, and separation seems to disappear. Fusion offers comfort to an unintegrated psyche. When inner wholeness has not yet formed, merging with another provides a sense of safety and belonging. The other becomes an emotional anchor, a reference point for meaning, direction, and worth. Decisions, moods, and self-perception subtly orient around the relationship. Love, in this state, is experienced as absorption rather than encounter. As awareness develops, the cost of fusion becomes apparent. The loss of boundaries leads to confusion rather than intimacy. Personal needs are suppressed to preserve harmony. Conflict feels threatening because it risks separation, and separation feels like fragmentation of the self. What once felt like closeness gradually reveals itself as dependency. The individual realizes that love has been confused with the fear of standing alone. Standing in wholeness marks a fundamental shift. The individual no longer approaches love from a place of inner division, but from self-presence. Emotional stability no longer depends on constant reassurance. Identity is not dissolved in relationship, but carried into it. This does not create distance, it creates clarity. Two individuals can now meet without needing to merge. In this state, love becomes an extension of inner fullness rather than a remedy for inner lack. The desire to fuse fades because there is nothing to escape from within. Boundaries are no longer defenses, but expressions of self-respect. Autonomy and connection coexist without conflict. Love no longer demands self-abandonment as proof of devotion. This transformation often feels quieter than the intensity of fusion. There is less drama, fewer emotional extremes, and more steadiness. To those accustomed to falling, this steadiness may seem unromantic, yet it carries a deeper intimacy. Standing in wholeness allows for genuine presence, because the self is not preoccupied with maintaining attachment or avoiding loss. In wholeness, love is no longer about losing oneself in another, but about sharing oneself with another. Differences do not threaten connection. Space does not diminish closeness. Each person remains rooted in their own inner ground while extending toward the other freely. What replaces falling is meeting, two complete beings standing, choosing connection without surrendering themselves. As awareness deepens, the orientation toward relationship quietly but profoundly changes. Where love was once driven by the search for completion, it becomes guided by resonance. The awakened individual no longer approaches another with the unconscious question of what is missing in themselves. Instead, there is a grounded sense of inner continuity that does not depend on being mirrored, affirmed, or rescued by another person. Completion seeking belongs to an earlier stage of psychological development, when the self experiences itself as fragmented. In that state, relationship becomes a solution to an internal problem. The other is unconsciously assigned the role of providing meaning, stability, identity, or emotional regulation. Attraction feels urgent because it is charged with survival. Losing the bond feels catastrophic because it threatens the coherence of the self. Awakening exposes this dynamic without condemnation. The individual begins to see that no relationship can permanently supply what has not been integrated internally. Emotional hunger, once projected outward, is now recognized as a call for inner attention. As these needs are met within, the compulsive pull toward another weakens. Love is no longer used as a substitute for self-connection. Resonance emerges in the absence of inner desperation. It is not loud or overwhelming. It does not override discernment or distort perception. Resonance feels like recognition without collapse, closeness without urgency. There is an ease in being oneself around the other, a natural alignment of values, rhythms, and presence. Nothing needs to be performed, proven, or secured. Clarity accompanies this shift. The awakened individual can see the other more accurately without the haze of fantasy or projection. Attraction no longer requires idealization. Differences are acknowledged without anxiety, and incompatibilities are not reframed as challenges to be conquered. The relationship is approached as it is, not as it must be to sustain inner balance. This clarity also introduces choice. Without the fear of incompleteness, the awakened can walk away from misalignment without self-betrayal. Love is no longer clung to as a lifeline. It is entered freely and left honestly when resonance is absent. This does not harden the heart, it stabilizes it. Seeking resonance rather than completion allows love to unfold as a shared experience rather than a psychological necessity. Two individuals meet not to fill gaps, but to explore connection from fullness. The bond grows through mutual presence, respect, and truth. In this way, love becomes less about being saved and more about being seen, clearly, calmly, and without illusion. And so love, when seen through awakened eyes, is no longer a force that overtakes the self, but a space the self can enter without disappearing. The illusions that once fueled longing dissolve, not because the heart has closed, but because it has matured. What remains is a capacity to relate without fear, to choose without compulsion, and to remain whole while standing with another. This form of love does not promise escape, completion, or endless intensity. It offers something quieter and far more enduring: clarity, presence, and truth. The awakened do not turn away from love. They turn toward it differently. No longer falling, no longer grasping, they meet, awake, grounded, and free,